this per-month deal, and hopefully fighters can start getting together, being smart.
The tension within the Ultimate Fighting Championship has reached a critical juncture.
I don't feel jaded, but I'm like, I want 15 million for one fight too.
Elite fighters including Israel Adesanya and Max Holloway are now openly challenging Dana White regarding compensation structures, with additional voices joining their cause. When White eventually responded to these concerns, the conflict intensified rapidly. Here's the complete breakdown of events. Adesanya and Holloway break their silence on fighter compensation. Israel Adesanya doesn't create controversy without substantial backing. This athlete boasts a 24-5 professional record, held the UFC middleweight championship twice, and secured a 2022 contract extension, placing him among the promotion's highest-earning competitors. His estimated UFC career earnings range from $15 million to $18.5 million, with individual fight purses reaching $2.4 million for major events. When Adesanya discusses fighter compensation, he's not speaking from financial desperation, but from earned credibility, deliberately leveraging his position.
It's just, you're Dana White. You came to this game, when no one believed in this, and you made it into a what now, $7.1 billion company.
Adesanya precisely articulated this perspective on his Freestyle Bender YouTube channel during early March 2026, positioning his comments not as attacks against Dana White, but as providing necessary context.
That's crazy. That's inspiring. That's like, you've proved it to them. So now, again, Zuffa is the next challenge. Zuffa Boxing is the next challenge that he set his eyes on.
His appreciation was sincere. He committed to a long-term UFC agreement while other competitors departed, though a significant shift was approaching.
But with that being said, don't forget he started in boxing, of course, but what brought you to...
He wasn't labeling Dana White as ungrateful, but rather emphasizing the foundational elements upon which that empire was constructed.
This is what got him to be the name Dana White, the UFC president, is this. So I can see why the other fighters, these guys are top class boxers. They're the best in the world at what they do, but so are we. This is the UFC. And if one guy can command that kind of money for one fight, and that's from the same company, Zuffa, and this is what's been keeping the lights on, is the UFC.
And then the line that became the headline.
I don't feel jaded, but I'm like, I want 15 million for one fight too.
Subsequently, he addressed the UFC's actual compensation offerings. This wasn't Adesanya's initial commentary on this topic. Following his February 2022 middleweight title defense against Robert Whittaker at UFC 271, he spoke directly about these issues.
With Francis's case, that he needed to bring that forward because it was atrocious, and I respect him for that. And like I said, this is the first step.
During that identical interview, Adesanya presented arguments that resonated then and continue resonating in 2026.
I'm not saying like pay the debutant some crazy money. I'm just like, nah, pay them enough to be able to, train, feed their family, and actually not have a second or third job, because we're UFC fighters. I love
that company reference was from 2022. 4 years subsequently, entry-level compensation remained approximately $12,000 to show. During a 2022 Forbes discussion, he elaborated further, calling it atrocious and stupid that the UFC heavyweight champion earned $600,000 per fight. He referenced Francis Ngannou, the world heavyweight champion, competing for $600,000, while meaningful trickle-down effects never reached lower roster positions. Regarding Max Holloway, the former featherweight champion and current BMF title holder, sat with Demetrius Johnson on the Mighty YouTube channel March 3rd, 2026, days before headlining UFC 326 against Charles Oliveira. His estimated UFC career earnings span $9.7 million to over $12.5 million, including a $2.7 million payday for his walk-off knockout of Justin Gaethje at UFC 300. Starting with $6,000 show money in 2012, his promotional loyalty remains unquestioned, precisely what gives his statements their impact. Holloway's chosen message wasn't about Dana White, but addressed locker room dynamics when fighters undercut each other.
This per-month deal, and hopefully fighters can start getting together, being smart.
He then presented an example that made fighters uncomfortable because they recognized its accuracy.
One time it's always going to stick out to my mind was when, I love Derek Lewis, man. He's a man. But when John Jones said,
Holloway referenced the 2021 situation when John Jones demanded $10 million to fight Francis Ngannou for the heavyweight title. The UFC declined. Derek Lewis, then ranked in the heavyweight division, publicly offered to take that same fight for $1 million.
give me a meal, I'll fight Francis now. It's like, man, we cannot be doing that, brother. You need to be like, yeah, John. You needed to almost stand.
The core argument stated plainly.
Because guess what? If you fighting for 10, then it looks like your base pay probably comes up too. You know what I mean?
Compensation scales and negotiations operate through precedent. When top card fighters accept lower amounts, it signals market value that impacts every fighter beneath them. When someone undercuts that request, the signal reverses direction. Holloway's guidance for emerging fighters emphasized understanding their worth.
I hope that these new fighters coming in, just know your worth, man. The main thing I would say, know your worth, know what it is. At the end of the day, hold your ground, bro.
According to MMA Junkie's coverage of the complete interview, Holloway also stated that if promoters immediately accept your asking price, you've significantly undervalued yourself. You want the firm rejection because that indicates you've actually identified your true worth. Two superstars, 1 week, identical conclusions. The structure required change, beginning with fighters ceasing to work against each other's interests. Understanding why that message carried such significance requires examining the actual structural reality. The $15 million catalyst and what Conor Benn's deal revealed. The agreement that triggered this entire situation was announced days before Adesanya and Holloway spoke in late February 2026. Dana White's new boxing venture, Zuffa Boxing, signed British welterweight Conor Benn to a single-fight contract reportedly worth $15 million, with some reports suggesting $20 million upside potential. Benn, the 29-year-old son of British boxing legend Nigel Benn, was scheduled to fight former two-time junior welterweight world champion Regis Prograis at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium in London on April 11, 2026, supporting Tyson Fury's comeback against Arslanbek Makhmudov. The event was expected to stream on Netflix. For context, Benn's record stood at 24-1 with 14 knockouts, but he had never held a major world title. By sports standards, without world title credentials, and as a fringe welterweight contender, he wasn't the fighter expected to receive the most eye-catching undercard payday in history. TKO president and COO Mark Shapiro clarified on earnings calls that the $15 million wasn't sourced from UFC or TKO budgets, but funded externally through Saudi-backed Sila Entertainment Company led by Turki Al-Sheikh, the same entity bankrolling several recent major boxing events. The UFC budget remained untouched, but this distinction meant nothing inside the locker room. The issue wasn't accounting practices, but optics. The same individual controlling the UFC, the organization paying fighters $12,000 debut show money, had just allocated $15 million to a single boxer for one fight under the same Zuffa name. Former UFC bantamweight champion Sean O'Malley went public February 24, 2026, stating he'd never heard of Benn and expressing frustration that despite building his name and character as a UFC star, he wasn't earning $15 million per fight. Welterweight contender Michael Venom Page called it hurtful and invoked Francis Ngannou directly, noting that a heavyweight champion was financially struggling despite his status. Demetrius Johnson framed the Benn deal on his YouTube channel as Dana White using Saudi-backed resources to poach a matchroom fighter and announce Zuffa Boxing's arrival as a power move against Eddie Hearn. If that was the goal, it succeeded, but created unexpected internal backlash. The X post by champion RDS aggregating Adesanya's reaction on March 4, 2026, generated 685,000 views. Its spread wasn't just due to Adesanya's fame, but because his reaction was measured rather than explosive, asking questions anyone could understand. If the UFC's builder was now paying a boxer $15 million for one fight under the same company name, what did that communicate about his own fighter's value to him? Understanding why fighters possess minimal power to address this requires examining the underlying structure. UFC fighters are classified as independent contractors rather than employees, meaning no union representation, no collective bargaining agreement, and no guaranteed revenue share. Every fighter negotiates individually, or more commonly doesn't negotiate due to power dynamics making real leverage nearly impossible except for top-tier athletes.
So why are a lot of fighters complaining about pay? Well, let's take a look at why fighters' pay could be so low. First off, there's only two main organizations to fight for in the MMA game.
The UFC maintains over 750 contracted fighters while running more than 44 annual events. Entry-level show pay approximates $12,000. Fighter training camps alone cost $10,000 to $50,000. After manager cuts, taxes, and camp expenses, entry-level fighters competing twice annually might net $20,000 to $40,000 from base pay for a sport requiring full-time training and acute physical injury risk every performance.
Now, supply and demand, like any other business, you have a bottleneck of a ton of fighters trying to get into the organizations, and there's only two of them. So they really can't shop around, they really cannot negotiate, and they have to go with either UFC or Bellator.
According to antitrust court documents from the Lee versus Zuffa case, UFC fighters received roughly 16 to 20% of total promotion revenue. NFL players receive approximately 48 to 50% through collective bargaining. This isn't a marginal difference, but the structural consequence of competing without union representation.
After going 6-0 in the UFC, I quickly realized that it was basically just a job that I was making between 40 and 80 grand a year, considering if I won fights or I lost. So at the end of the day, it was just another job.
Francis Ngannou described the negotiation process mechanics that never appear in Dana White's press conferences.
In an article that was released, it stated that the UFC pays their fighters between 12 and 18% of the total revenue. Now, when you compare that to other professional leagues like the NFL or the NHL, they make 40 to 50%.
Long-term exclusive contracts with renewal options kept fighters locked in for years, while right of first refusal clauses gave the UFC ability to match any outside offers. John Jones, arguably the greatest UFC fighter in history, spent multiple years in contract disputes resulting in extended inactivity rather than resolution reflecting his actual value.
They pay you whatever they want to pay you. They let you pretend that you're negotiating while you're not negotiating, because either way, you'll stay in the...
These aren't regional show fighters, but UFC athletes in combat sports' most successful promotion, living in gyms because they cannot afford apartments. The 2015 Reebok uniform deal deepened the problem. Previously, fighters could negotiate personal sponsorships worth $30,000, $50,000 per fight. When the UFC replaced individual sponsorships with a tiered Reebok deal, those income streams disappeared almost overnight, replaced by structured payments as low as $4,000 per event for fighters with 1 and 3 UFC bouts. For a large roster portion, it represented a pay cut disguised as standardization. The structure was built for scale, growth, and promotional control. As long as 750 fighters remained willing to accept contracts because the alternative meant not competing at elite level, leverage would remain exactly where it had always been. Fighters attempting to challenge this through legal action discovered how slow that process could be.
Most of the guys who are doing the absolute worst are not in a position that they could say publicly, I have a second job. I'm borrowing money from my parents.
Right.
I know so many fighters that are living in the Jackson's MMA gym because they can't afford to have their own apartment. And they're UFC fighters.
That is John Jones.
In 2014 and 2015, current and former UFC fighters accomplished something unprecedented in MMA by filing a federal antitrust class action lawsuit against the promotion. The case, known as Lee versus Zuffa, was filed in U.S. District Court for the District of Nevada. Plaintiffs included fighters Kung Lei, John Fitch, and Nate Quarry, arguing under Section 2 of the Sherman Antitrust Act that the UFC used its dominant market position, controlling approximately 90% of elite MMA revenue in the United States, to suppress fighter wages below competitive market levels. This constituted monopsony, where a single dominant buyer of labor uses that dominance to artificially suppress wages. The UFC hadn't merely grown organically, but had acquired or eliminated major competitors like Strikeforce in 2011, WEC, and Pride FC until it controlled the market so completely that fighters had nowhere else to compete at elite level. Unsealed case documents confirmed the UFC had commissioned its own internal study of fighter pay, Economic experts for plaintiffs estimated total damages in the billions, with fighters receiving roughly 20% or less of revenue, far below competitive market production. The case required a decade to resolve. An initial $35 million settlement was rejected by Judge Richard Franklin Boulware II in July 2024 as inadequate. The UFC returned with $375 million plus approximately $6.6 million in interest. Final approval came February 6, 2025. After attorneys took approximately $126.7 million in fees and costs, roughly $251 million remained for distribution. The formula provided approximately 32.7% of a fighter's total class period compensation, plus $14,179 per fight. Anderson Silva received the highest individual payout at approximately $10.33 million. Around 35 fighters received over $1 million. The median payout was roughly $86,000, with minimum payments approximately $15,000 to $16,000. An unprecedented 97% of eligible fighters, roughly 1,100 people, filed claims. That 97% figure alone reflects how broadly underpayment was felt across the roster. The settlement covered only December 2010 to June 2017. A second case, Johnson vs. Zuffa, covers 2017 to present and remains active. Fighters witnessing the Benn deal in 2026 have yet to see legal resolution for their period. Critically, the settlement didn't change the structure, with no mandated revenue share, no union, and no base pay floor tied to UFC revenue. The $375 million compensated for documented past suppression, not fixing the system that enabled it. The agreement included limits on some restrictive provisions, but the monopoly, independent contractor classification, and power imbalance remained intact. Sean Strickland, speaking to Complex on February 21, 2026, following his UFC Houston main event victory over Anthony Hernandez, stated the current situation plainly. Regarding pay scale compared to any other sporting event, the UFC is the most problematic. Athlete pay versus UFC earnings shows no argument exists that it's fair. It's predatory. Asked about excitement over doubled bonuses, he responded negatively, noting no one's getting paid more, and suggesting better earnings at Walmart. The former middleweight champion targeted the structure, not just numbers. Dana White had an answer for all of it, the same one he's provided for 20 years.
Do you make enough money?
No, absolutely not.
Do you make enough money? I mean,
Absolutely not.
I want you to meet the guy that goes, "Oh, I'm good. I make plenty of money. I don't need another dime."
Dana White maintains one consistent response to fighter pay questions over 2 decades without change. He's never pretended the UFC pays every fighter like a superstar, arguing it shouldn't, can't, and that attempting to would destroy the business. His core positions remain consistent across more than 2 decades. UFC fighters are independent contractors in a high-risk, high-reward sport where the system rewards performance. Fighters who become draws, win titles, and generate PPV buys move up the pay scale, while those who don't. In White's framing, that's not exploitation, but how markets function. In a 2022 GQ interview, he explained his perspective clearly.
We built a business model where they share. If you're the champion, you share in the pay-per-view revenue. You eat what you kill.
Regarding fighters who feel they deserve more, he clearly stated it's never happening while he's in charge, believing these fighters receive appropriate compensation. Champions become partners in PPV revenue. Top draws receive PPV points. The model rewards performance rather than guaranteeing high salaries for fighters who haven't proven their drawing power. If you don't like it, there are alternatives.
And if you don't like the way that it's run here, there's no barrier to entry. Start your own mixed martial arts organization and you pay the guys whatever you think you want to pay.
White's counter-argument to boxing comparisons has foundation.
With boxing too, is that all guys are overpaid. And every time they put on a fight, it's a going out of business sale. You know what I mean? We're just trying to get as much money as we can from you guys, and then we're out of here, and we'll see you in 3 years. You can't build a league like that. You can't build a sport. You can't have 750 fighters under contract making money.
He's not entirely incorrect. Boxing's model has produced megastars and financial disasters equally. Promoters go bankrupt, fighters go unpaid. The UFC, by contrast, runs 44-plus annual events for years without major financial implosion. The economics of managing 750 contracted fighters are genuinely more complex than negotiating single-event deals for one boxer.
The way that it works is, there's a standard level of pay, depending on who you are and how you make it, how you climb up the ladder. So what happens is when you become a world champion, you become a partner. So when you got the belt, you share in the pay-per-view revenue.
For elite fighters, the system delivers results. Conor McGregor earned tens of millions through PPV shares. John Jones receives multi-million-dollar guarantees. The UFC can create life-changing money for top performers. But fighters' questions aren't about the top tier, but about the other 700. White's January 2026 bonus announcement was legitimate. Performance of the Night and Fight of the Night awards both doubled to $100,000. A new $25,000 finish bonus was added. But as Adesanya noted, that money isn't guaranteed. Justin Gaethje had collected 14 bonuses across his career, totaling less than $1 million. That represents the gap between what bonus structure advertises and actually delivers. In August 2025, after the Paramount deal announcement, White promised the low-hanging fruit that's easy to answer, bonuses obviously increasing. He framed it as a rising tide. By early 2026, fighters had seen the tide with increased bonuses, but for most of the roster, base pay hadn't moved. What makes 2026 different isn't that fighters are angry. They've always been angry. What makes this moment different is who's speaking and what they're choosing to say despite their positions. Adesanya has never called for a union, praised Dana White alongside his criticism, and signed a long-term deal in 2022. 4 years later, he's still saying the structure needs change, not for him but for fighters living in gyms because they cannot afford apartments, carrying the same UFC contract and taking home fractions of the money. Eddie Hearn, who lost Conor Benn to a $15 million Zuffa offer, gave his assessment of what UFC fighters must be feeling, being absolutely ripped off, generating more revenue than these guys, while receiving a tenth of the money. The UFC is worth somewhere between 20-30 billions, as Dana White has cited. The Paramount deal brings $1.1 billion annually from North America alone. The second antitrust case covering 2017 to present continues through courts. The fighters producing content that underpins all that value are still, as of early March 2026, competing for $12,000 show money at entry level. The $375 million settlement covered one 7-year period. The mathematics on full career spans of fighters who built the modern UFC, competing from the early 2000s into the Conor McGregor era and beyond, reveals where the money actually went, and it wasn't to the people getting hit. Bonuses are up, base pay remains largely unchanged. A second lawsuit continues running. The Paramount deal added revenue at the top without fundamentally changing bottom-tier structure. The same person controlling all of that just allocated $15 million to a boxer most of his own fighters had never heard of. Adesanya didn't call it theft or threaten to leave. He simply said what everyone in that locker room was already thinking. The fact that it needed to be said at all, that two of the sport's most respected figures had to quietly remind the man who built an empire that they helped him build it, tells the complete story. Like this video, and don't forget to explore more similar content through the suggested cards on your screen.